I'm on the phone here with Misha. Misha, pronounce your last name for me, buddy.
Misha Salkinder.
Okay, I'm on the phone here with Misha Salkinder. We're going to talk today about DIY attribution, and we're talking about when we think custom models are a good idea. And we're going to start things out here by just having a quick conversation around what you're seeing. Misha spends a lot of time with customers who spend a fair amount of energy with DIY models. Often we displace those models at CaliberMind. Talk to us about sort of the range of models based on sophistication, Misha, that you see. And then I want to talk about really what are optionality for those models when we start realizing that those models aren't going to work. We're going to have to customize them.
Yeah, thank you. Well, firstly, I think as we talk about the range of models, on the very low end is probably doesn't actually deal much with data, and it's more intuition or hunch. I've worked in an organization where that was the main driver for a long time. We have a feeling this works, and so we should do that again. And that is a type of a very low sophistication attribution model. But conceptually, it's trying to get to the idea of, well, what can we repeat? But as we're really talking about data-driven decision-making, I would say that on the low end, there are attribution models that come out of the box. Salesforce comes to mind, solutions that are built within the tool, and really what feeds the model are elements within that CRM. So as it comes to Salesforce, it's specifically leads contacts within Salesforce. It's campaign members that are only recorded within Salesforce, and opportunities in the same CRM. And these data points, the built-in Salesforce attribution model is as far as my knowledge of it is kind of a single touch model where all of the opportunity dollars are given to that one event, that one campaign member. And so you can answer questions like, oh, for that one opportunity, did a specific campaign or did marketing overall touch that opportunity? You could say, interesting, for that opportunity, we had this many touches and this many of them were marketing, or there weren't any marketing.
So that's the low end, right? This is the low end. So low end meaning, it's available, it's straightforward. I can use first, last touch. It's based on a single touch point. I heard recently that middle touch has been introduced as well, so we'll see how that's looking. And so that's sort of the out-of-box model that the standard typical Salesforce user would encounter. That, by the way, is not going to help with the mix of first and third-party data, but it's a starting point. It takes you, as you talked about, from intuition to actually being able to answer some of those questions, not in a terribly sophisticated way. What's sort of the upper end? Like, what do you see when it's a really sophisticated model? What's like the Maserati of self-built DIY attribution models that you encounter?
Yeah, they're driven by very specific questions. So that's first and foremost. A degree up from what we just spoke about would be an attribution model that you're comfortable, probably would be a multi-touch model, that you would be comfortable to report on a month-by-month or a quarter-by-quarter basis to gauge how you're doing as a marketing team or as a revenue operations team. On the high end, you get very tactical. You start comparing two different types of webinars that seemingly have the same number of responses, but you start looking at the output of those down the line and start comparing one to the other based on their attribution and saying, well, if I have resources to only run one of these, which should it be? On the high end are questions that are around ad performance and where we want to double down in terms of more advertising dollars. And on the high end are questions around specific opportunities or specific opportunity stages. And we'll probably talk about this a little bit more when we dive into some of these models, but questions around not attribution around maybe pipeline and op creation, but are the campaigns that help me create opportunities different from those that help me advance opportunities, right? All of a sudden, we're looking at two different models potentially with two different time frames and maybe even different inputs into
so
each
if model. I'm getting this right, the least sophisticated model sort of built into Sales Cloud is sort of score keeping, and it's using a very limited data set to keep score. On the more sophisticated end, I'm getting to the point where I've parsed my data and organized in such a way that I'm beginning to talk about how I got to that scorekeeping. Maybe best way to express it is funnels. I'm actually seeing sort of the progression of an opportunity or an account object, and I'm able to evaluate what actions and reactions are causing folks to migrate through the funnel. And so when we think about that more sophisticated model, Misha, what are some of those components? Like, what are classic components? Like, I've got to imagine you've got to have a decent data warehouse sort of sitting in the background. What other elements would you say are part of that DIY model typically?
Yes, certainly data warehouse. All of a sudden, you start seeing things like both first and third party data coming in. Web behavior and the sources of web behavior become important. Opportunity stages, and to your point, I actually think on the advanced version of attribution, this is where lines really get blurry between funnel measurement and attribution.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, kind of thinking of movement along a marketing funnel in terms of attribution is a really advanced and I think a fascinating use case. Right? So all of a sudden you're in, an advanced use case, you might not even look at opportunity dollars as the outcome. You might look at your stage 3 transition as the outcome. And you say, what activities do I have to do in stage 2 in order to move to stage 3? So in order to do that, yes, we need to have campaign members. Yes, we need to identify which web events are useful and could be even categorized as campaign members, even though they're not. And also, how do I define stage 2 and stage 3? Do I have good systems to say, let's say it's on the account level, is it just MQA and sales converted leads, or is there more nuance in there? So I think all of those are probably components.
Which is an incredibly sophisticated model, by the way, Misha. So we're talking about something that's self-built, that is, it's not equivalent to what CaliberMind would do, but you're starting to be able to answer some of those questions with that more sophisticated model. Now, of course, you've got data warehouse you're deploying, you've got a BI layer, you've got analysts that are out there sort of using great queries to tease that information out. But you're starting to get to a level of sophistication that you can only match with really out-of-the-box software packages at this point. You're really on the top end of the sophistication curve. So what I want to understand is, when do these quote-unquote out-of-the-box models start to break? And then when do we start thinking about customizing those models? Fully admitting, Misha, that each of those models is a custom model in and of itself, right? So
Sure.
We're talking about when you customize the customized model, but when do you see things starting to break? You deal with clients all the time that are trying to manage these models, quite often alongside out-of-the-box models. When does customization start creeping in?
Yeah, there are certainly pivot points on customers' journeys that stand out. One big one is when we start asking ourselves about the partnership of marketing and sales. I often see that coming in. Oh, we have a good sense of how marketing is doing. And all of a sudden, we look more holistically at our organization and we say, well, can we think about the entire buyer journey? And what happens if we start introducing sales touches in the mix as well? This is a classic kind of campaign creation that I've seen, where all of a sudden we say, well, what kind of proxies, or how can we even measure sales touches as part of the buyer journey? And can we, when we slice up dollar amounts for attribution, can we actually include those in so that the marketing share becomes a more realistic, or at least we can have better conversation around what should follow. Are we seeing these touches happen much more frequently after opportunities are created, or these sorts of touches happening before? And that starts bringing on a whole new layer of questions of, well, how are those touches different? And if this brings me probably to a second type of customization, if we were to look only at touches that happen between I created this opportunity and closing this opportunity, all of a sudden sales is much more involved. And all of a sudden your campaigns like demo requests and things like that have dropped off. So then you can start asking the questions like, well, should I be investing in events for opportunities, for organizations for whom I have opportunities? And all of a sudden you can start, right? You can really ask interesting ROI questions by saying, well, let me look only at sales touches and introduce only events, only certain event types in there, right? Physical event sponsorships, for example. And all of a sudden you can have a really interesting ROI question that when looking at the whole buyer journey might be really harder to answer.
But I mean, that sounds so hard. Is it really that hard, Misha? I mean, don't you just use your I don't know, SalesLoft or Outreach API to connect into Snowflake? Like, why is that so hard? Like, how is it so hard to integrate? Oh yeah, I know. You've got to have a solid underlying scoring model, and by the way, you've got to understand what your underlying attribution model is. And by the way, can you live with just a single attribution model? We just ripped on poor Sales Cloud for only being able to do first touch and last touch, right? And they're like, oh, they have middle touch now. So unpack that for me a bit if you wouldn't mind. So I understand getting the data on board, but how does the underlying logic of attribution, or the lack thereof in a DIY model, do it yourself, sort of force you towards that customization? Because my sense is that's really the tough part. Everything else is an API, right?
The biggest challenges I see are on the intersections of use case and technicality. So theoretically speaking, we're saying here, yes, fairly straightforward, slicing up dollars by touches. But of course, the devil's in the details. And it's being able to ask, what are the right touches to include for the CMO to trust this? And if you have people driving this project that are very technical, I have found that the business questions get lost. And if it's driven really by marketing, by the ones that really want to drive it, there simply isn't often the technical knowledge of, oh wait, okay, I have these campaign members in Salesforce, and I want to introduce things from outreach. How would I even do that? And that's a big volume of data. And then you say, but how do I understand that that's a response and that's not just an automatic reply, right? Again, in the details. And then I think on top of it all is some of the most interesting questions have to do with personas and how different personas interact and how we should approach different personas. And the normalization and standardization of personas is a whole endeavor just in itself. So yes, absolutely doable. Just think it requires a really deep business knowledge, a really deep technical knowledge, and then finding a way to work together.
Did I just break the DIY model by accident, Misha? did I just go so far outside? So because let's just acknowledge, at the end of the day, this is 90% of people are using a DIY model. Our job here is not to pull apart the DIY model. Our job is to help people understand how to manage their DIY models, right? So I feel like what I've done is just pushed us so far to the customization level that we've really broken your standard, even your more sophisticated DIY models' ability to really handle several underlying factors, one of which is, can you actually bridge between different multi-touch attribution models, middle touch, W-shaped, middle weight, last touch, first touch, that. But you're actually blowing it out of the water, my friend. You're talking about, how do I start integrating the logic behind personas and their buyer journeys, and how does that impact? So I guess I have to ask the question, is that something that can happen with it in a DIY model? And if so, how do we customize? Like, what are some of the steps we can use to customize? And I'm in the Snowflake sort of BI layer world right now when I ask that question.
A lot of ugly logic behind the scenes, right? I think the output is a lot of coding. I think the output ultimately is ideally, right, is a standardized department, standardized job level, and you say, I want to slice by this. I want to understand what this looks like only for VPs of marketing. But things like job titles are messy. And unfortunately, there is no neat way out of the box. In a solution like CaliberMind, there is. But if you were to do this yourself, there isn't a neat way to standardize job titles, long formulas, and a lot of edge cases. It's amazing how, an account manager and a CCO get confused because of, word lookups. So things like that. It's very iterative, right? It's very, very iterative, and it'll take time. And like I say, I think organizations that will be successful in doing so are ones that understand that, first of all, the importance of good underlying data and not the output of it. And also that it's a journey, right? And it's an iterative journey. And that data today looks better than it did yesterday, and processes are better to ingest this data, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be perfect overnight. And that you'll have a useful model today, and that useful model will enable you to ask the next question, which is going to force you to iterate some more, right? So I think the organizations that understand it's not going to be an overnight, like, oh yeah, I'm going to solve all the questions, are probably ones that are going to be most successful.
Okay, well, let me recover from the fact that we just blew up the rocket on the launch pad. Let's go back a little bit, because we're all, I think, we're talking about the more sophisticated end of the scale, and I have to say I've seen some really impressive models, and I feel like everything that we just thrown out there are really good coders and really great analysts out there that can manage through. I've dealt with a couple of former MIT people that have managed those models well. So let's go right back to the middle a little bit, if we can, Misha. And let's talk about, and I want to specifically talk about event tags and how that can help. Let's put this middle ground model in place. How about that? Sort of, we talked about like there being a range. Solidly in the middle, what does that look like? And then how would somebody start thinking about using something like event tags to customize that model? So what's the middle ground? Is this a, we're still talking about like Snowflake plus a BI layer? Like, what does that middle ground DIY model look like for you?
Yes, Snowflake, BI layer, CRM, marketing automation platform, and probably importantly, some web tracker, right? Segment of sorts. It's important to, campaigns can give you a good answer as of what did we run? Was it an event? Was it a form? Was it a demo request? More sophisticated questions, but still, I think fairly in the middle range will be around, well, where did they come from? We had demo requests, and maybe we even look at that as an output. Where did those come from? And that's where I think event tags play a really important role, where we can see things like, well, for these kinds of opportunities, we see that these campaigns drove much of the attribution. And I imagine that most companies will see that sometimes you might be surprised by what you see, and I would focus on those surprises. But you might see others that say, well, yeah, our demo request is going to give us 30% of our attribution, because that's just part of the sales motion, right? Every opportunity probably went through a demo at some point, and so it has a significant share of attribution. And that's when we can focus in on this campaign and maybe slice by the event tags. And you say, well, interesting. So for this, I know that's an important thing for us to focus on. We want to drive more of this. Well, what are the sources, right? What are the mediums that actually help drive this one campaign? So I'm a big fan of, when creating a unified event timeline, like we spoke about in other webinars, other calls. When creating this unified event timeline, yes, of course, including campaign data, but also including things like channel, and including other event tags that can help us slice the data when we want to ask a more specific question.
And that feels like the core of the customization question we're really talking about is, what are you customizing to? And that unified timeline, that's what I hear consistently. It's, you're getting to the point where you realize, I need to have that unified timeline, right? And I need to be able to associate activities with that timeline. By the way, I love the fact that you started with, attribution for demo requests. As we all know, that shows the highest intent, but you cannot create demo requests. So every model I've ever seen oversubscribes, in other words, overscores demo requests. Sorry, I just had to make that little tangent, but that we all fall into that trap of the DIY models. To fall out of that trap, so you fall into that trap of the DIY models, to fall out of it, you really got to have a more sophisticated ability to manage scoring and to be able to do that sort of reflexively over time. So let's circle around that, because I think it's the most important concept for people reading today, is this idea that you have a unified timeline really as a backbone that sort of lives alongside your scoring and lives alongside the product of that, which is your attribution model. And so that's really what you're talking about, Misha, is how do I use event tags to really locate a buyer? And you talked about a particular persona on that event journey. And when you were talking about personas, is that what you're referring to, saying potentially you have different timelines based on persona? In other words, I am a higher authority, and therefore my buyer persona timeline is different and my buying cycle is different. Is that right?
Yes, yes, that's spot on. There are certain buying committee members that get introduced to different parts of the buying cycle, it seems, and you might want to optimize or tune your messaging to those, depending on where an organization might be in their, or a prospect might be with the organization. So that is exactly it. And I really like what you reiterated there, which really is at the crux of DIY attribution. For me, the most important things are not necessarily the model we ultimately select, because it's, you know, it's more about asking the right business questions and making sure that we have a really solid, unified buyer journey data set. With those two things in place, there are many intelligent people out there that can slice the data and figure out, well, these events happened before this, so let me, split this dollar amount in this way. But the big potholes that I've seen are not pushing enough on the business questions. What are we really trying to answer here, right? Is just showing, marketing touched 70% of the deals this month. Perhaps that's sufficient. And I think, and maybe at a high level, that's a good enough question, but can we really take decisions to move this up to 71, 72, 73% next quarter, next month? And do we really feel in control of that? But the real engine, as always, is a clean, normalized, and standardized event timeline that comes from multiple sources and includes, to your point, other fields by which we could slice the data, like channels, like event tags for that specific campaign member, so that in case we want to ask the question of, well, not what should we do more of, but for whom or where, we could answer those questions as well.
Yeah, and I feel like you've answered my next question, Misha. So let me state it and make sure I got it right. But the question was going to be, what's the tipping point towards customization? And I feel like what we're saying here, and you check me if I'm wrong, but the tipping point is you can't answer those original business questions you started when you built the model, because you lack that underlying timeline, event timeline. That's usually, it feels like that's usually the point. And I will say, having helped with or built multiple different DIY models in my career, I actually worked for not going to disclose the name of the company. I worked for a company that provided attribution software and actually was so unhappy with it, had us build our own model. But it became really that tipping point for me was I didn't have that event timeline. And then next level for me was I couldn't tell you the difference in whether or not that timeline measured the appropriate output, meaning attribution, because everybody was considered the same buyer persona and had the same role in the buying committee. And that's when we started tipping to, hey, what are our event tags? What does it look like in a timeline? So is that, did I answer the question I asked? Did I do a good job answering my own question, Misha? Is that right? Is that the tipping point?
Yes, it's absolutely. It's understanding that we've seen these results. You start getting a sense of, yeah, I kind of know what I'm going to see next month. It gets expected. You stop learning new things from it. And so mature organizations, sophisticated teams that really try to push themselves will get into more granular questions. And it's at that point that I think a more sophisticated model might be warranted. The really interesting thing about this, and why we focus so much in CaliberMind as to this unified data set, is the output of this clean and trusted data set will power much more than your attribution. You'll be able to answer so many more marketing questions that lie, to our very first point, on the intersection of different questions and models. Yes, attribution give you really interesting insights, but if you look at attribution between funnel stages, you get that much more interesting insights. And so I think we come back, and I probably have reiterated this, but come back to this engine, and really its power. It doesn't, I think many, particularly marketers, that just want to act, and then right, we want to do the next sexy campaign. I think often miss the real strength and value of clean data and its power in your decision making.
Well, folks are reading, and folks that are listening in, just say that was an excellent pitch towards when you completely blow up your DIY model, why you should be looking at a better data set. End of the day, it's really what we're talking about here, and the discipline around the data set and the ability to really adjust and manage that. Final question for you, Misha. I'm going to let you get back to your day, but so I sort of feel like I have run into these people. You have too, which is I am super awesome and smart, and I can handle any level of customization necessary, especially with the more sophisticated models. And Misha, what I want to do is send a message out to those folks, which is to say, and there's a question here, I promise, which is to say, look, we're not trying to challenge those models. What we're trying to do is to give you sort of guideposts towards potentially when those models start breaking, when your self-built model starts breaking. Any advice for those folks that are listening in right now, Misha, that are sort of on the edge of customization collapse, if you will? Would you have them go back and look, follow our advice, let's look at that underlying data model, or is that too scary? In other words, have I dug myself such a hole that it's impossible to get out
of? In that situation, I would go back to the basics, and I would start with the conversation with my CMO, and I probably would ask, what are the four things that you're looking to answer? You might, I know we've spoken a lot about complexity today. You might be able to simplify the model a lot based on those questions. If your priority right now is op acceleration, and you know there's only certain types of touches that are of interest, then maybe a model only with those touches is enough. If your priority is figuring out more around web, then maybe focusing on those is enough. Yes, of course, an ideal situation is where you have a model that can pivot to different questions that arise every quarter and different changing priorities of the organization. But it is, adoption of these models is all going to come down to trust. And so I recommend really just aligning the questions with the current model, making sure that you get a lot of nods, to yes, okay, this has been useful. Because the worst thing is to put a lot of effort into this, and you get the first two people looking at the model and just saying, this just doesn't make any sense. And that's really hard to recover from.
Okay. Well, to the 90% of the market that is sitting on top of these really sophisticated DIY models, we say, take heart. I love your advice. Go back to the original question set. What is it you were looking for originally? Because these things migrate, scope creeps. By the way, you probably have a new CMO that came in after you actually built the original model. Go back and see what they need. The other advice I would give is, you think about what's happening in terms of really three layers. Layer number one is, what are we reporting to the board? Layer number two is, what's meaningful for the CMO? And layer number three is, what's an operating layer that allows me to make those decisions for the business? If you follow that and Misha's advice, folks, I think you're going to have a much more successful DIY model. Misha, you're a busy guy, and you've got not a lot of time in your day, so thank you today for joining us. Appreciate the conversation. Anything else you want to add before we sign off to our friends managing these DIY models? Drink another glass of beer?
Absolutely. No, Doug, thank you so much. I'll just say that I'm always happy to chat if anybody has any questions or just wants advice around their own models, around attribution, marketing analytics in general, and CaliberMind. I'll be happy to chat.
He's not kidding. He loves these conversations, folks. Reach out to Misha. Misha, what are your social media handles in case somebody takes you up on this offer?
Yeah, Misha Salkander on LinkedIn, or through the CaliberMind website.
Okay. So you're not going to offer up your former Twitter handle, your X handle, Misha?
I do not know what my former Twitter handle is.
Misha, thanks for the time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Doug.
All right.